The topic we will study is about the first trumpet. The 7 angels are ready to blow their trumpets. At each trumpet sound, a chain of events takes place on the earth. These events must be understood as a series of interventions of God in history in response to the prayers of his people. Revelation chapter 8 verse 7. And the first angel sounded his trumpet, and there were hail and fire mixed with blood. And they were hurled down to the earth, and a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up. Hail and fire mixed with blood. This phrase recalls the 7th plague of the Exodus. Hail mixed with fire was God's judgment upon the Egyptians and had a devastating effect. Another major source for this imagery is the prophecy of Ezekiel against Gog. Hail and fire mixed with blood were God's executive judgment on this enemy of Judah. Ezekiel chapter 38 verse 22 and 23. With pestilence and bloodshed I will enter into judgment with him, and I will rain upon him and his hordes and the many peoples who are with him torrential rains and hailstones, fire and sulfur. So I will show my greatness and my holiness and make myself known in the eyes of many nations. Then they will know that I am the Lord. Although fire or hail are sometimes used in judgment against Israel for forsaking the covenant, the images of hail mixed with fire in the Old Testament are God's consistent weapon of judgment on the nations that were in opposition to God and his people. The phrase, a third. This phrase shows that the 4 angels have control over 4 quarters of the earth. The trumpet plagues, however, affect 1/3 of the earth. In the prophecies of Ezekiel and Zechariah, judgments against apostate Israel are described in terms of plagues affecting 1/3 after another of the nation. Ezekiel chapter 5 verse 12 and 13. A third part of you shall die of pestilence and be consumed with famine in your midst. A third part shall fall by the sword all around you, and a third part will scatter to all the winds, and will unsheathe the sword after them. Thus shall my anger spend itself, and I will vent my fury upon them and satisfy myself. And they shall know that I am the Lord, that I have spoken in my jealousy, when I spend my fury upon them. In Revelation 12 verse 4. The tail of the great red dragon in heaven, Satan himself, swept away a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth, meaning that 1/3 of the angels followed him and were under his control. Especially interesting is that the symbolic Babylon is split into 3 parts as God brings his judgments against it. Revelation chapter 16 verse 19. The great city was split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell, and God remembered Babylon the Great, to make her drain the cup of the wine of the fury of his wrath. It would be very appropriate to conclude that the phrase, the third part, of the trumpets in Revelation chapter 8 to 9, denotes a portion of Satan's kingdom experiencing divine judgments. Then, I'd like to underscore the phrase, the trees, and all green grass. In the Old Testament, symbols of trees and green grass are used figuratively with reference to Israel as God's covenant people. Psalm chapter 72 verse 16. May there be abundance of grain in the land. On the tops of the mountains may it wave. May its fruit be like Lebanon. And may people blossom in the cities, like the grass of the field. Jesus also used tree symbolism in referring to the Jewish people as the green tree and as a fig tree that did not bear fruit. As the first angel blows his trumpet, hail and fire mixed with blood are hurled down upon the earth. In the Old Testament, hail and fire are God's weapons of judgment used against those who oppose him and oppress his people. In the first place, they recall the 7th plague of hail and fire that devastated the entire land of Egypt, destroying every plant and tree of the field, for the refusal to let the Israelites go. It also brings to one's mind the prophecy of Ezekiel where God fights against Gog, the enemy nation from the north, through the use of hail and fire mixed with blood. Ezekiel 38 verse 22. With pestilence and bloodshed I will enter into judgment with him, and I will rain upon him and his hordes and the many peoples who are with him torrential rains and hailstones, fire and sulfur. Thus, hail and fire accompanied by much bloodshed are God's means of intervention in judgment, particularly for those nations which oppress his people. The effect of this trumpet blast on the earth is that a third of the trees was burned up, and all green grass was burned up. In the Old Testament, trees and green grass often symbolize Israel as God's people. Fire-destroying vegetation symbolizes God's weapons of judgment used against his own people when they became unfaithful to the covenant of God. The key text for understanding the tree symbolism in the first trumpet scene is found in Jesus' prophecy about the inhabitants of Jerusalem. For if they do these things in the green tree, what will happen in the dry? Luke 23 verse 31. It is clear that Jesus referred here to himself as the green tree, and to apostate Jews as the dry trees. When Jesus was treated in such a way as the green tree, what hope had the nation that was dry due to its opposition to and rejection of Jesus? Most biblical scholars maintain that Jesus referred here to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in AD 70. The very event that he described in his eschatological discourse on the Mount of Olives. This biblical evidence leads one to conclude that the first trumpet blast portrays the consequences visited upon those who rejected and crucified Jesus and opposed the gospel. Both the people and their leaders were held responsible for those acts. As God's covenant people, they had full access to the promises of God. However, a sizable number of them became opponents to the gospel and persecutors of God's new covenant people. Now, they are the first ones to experience the consequences of rejecting the covenant. The Bible states clearly that judgment begins at the house of God, 1 Peter 4 verse 17. Just as in the Old Testament, hail and fire symbolize the divine judgments that would fall on the enemies of Israel. So in the scene of the first trumpet, hail and fire mixed with blood portray in symbolic language the divine judgment poured upon God's own people who rejected his covenant and became the oppressors and persecutors of the followers of Christ. In the destruction of the Jewish nation with its capital city Jerusalem in AD 70, many of the Jews were burned up. For the Jewish people, this event still remains one of the bitterest chapters in their history.